solar eclipse is just 8 days away, and NASA announced that they will launch 3 rockets during the eclipse. The rockets will help scientists study how Earth's upper atmosphere is affected during the phenomenon. The rockets were also launched during last year's annular solar eclipse. They were recovered in New Mexico. The total solar eclipse is happening on April 8th, and the next one isn't until 2044. So scientists are taking advantage of the rare opportunity to collect important data.
Shalom, Kahala Yahawah Ba'Shem Yahawashi, Ba'Shem Qadash. Double honors to my teachers, the apostles and elders of Great Millstone. Peace and mercy to the elect, who are the house of David reborn again in this generation. And shalom to the 1/3 of Yasharallah, who today are known as the Negroes, Latinos, and Native Americans, who before losing our true heritage were known as, and still are, the true Hebrew Israelites of the Holy Bible. In today's lesson, we're going to go into some of the events and great lengths that Esau is making during the solar eclipse, which is going to take place in about 4 days. So, never mind what that news reporter said 8 days ago. That was from the first. Well, before we get into this and why I'm making this lesson and how this actually goes all the way back to the time of the Tower of Babel, let's read this first. This is Obadiah 1:4. Though thou exalt thyself as the eagle, and though thou set thy nest amongst the stars, thence will I bring thee down, saith Yahawah Ba'Shem Yahawashi. And that's ultimately the Lord's message to these Edomites. Okay, and when I say Edomites, I'm talking about the so-called Caucasian race. You see, they're not Caucasians, and they're not whites. Their true identity, the identity that they run from, is that of the Edomites. Okay, they descend from a man known as Esau, which was the evil twin brother of Jacob. Going back further in their lineage to the line of Cain, because again, Esau is simply just Cain in the reincarnation. There was another curse put upon him that he would be a fugitive and a vagabond upon the earth, which is why these Edomites always run from their heritage, their identity, and they never really pay for all the calamities they've done around the world, because that's ultimately going to come at the end, right? Like the scripture says, right? From thence shall the Lord bring these devils down. And what did that mean? That meant that when these devils, they reach their pinnacle, that being the astronaut launches into space, or at least low Earth orbit, because they don't go to space, they just go into the higher atmosphere, what they refer to as LEO, low Earth orbit. That's where the ISS is, and all humans are right there. Everything above that in actual space is simply just satellites and robots. Okay, so that being said, these devils are going to go ahead and perform a launch into the shadow of the solar eclipse. And they give all scientific reasons, but I'm going to break it down spiritually, show you that these devils are simply doing this to mock God, and they're more than likely trying to do it to hurt the Lord spiritually in some sort of way. Because again, you got to remember, these Edomites, they're all witches and warlocks. Okay, NASA, we've all heard it. It's Hebrew for deceiver. The thing is this has been set up to deceive the masses, right? Yeah, NASA does do some really high tech, crazy things, right, with tech and everything, but for the most part, they're a PR propaganda arm of Esau to show their dominance over the world. Okay, now let's go and read this article to find out what's actually going on. It says, NASA to launch sounding rockets into the moon's shadow during the solar eclipse. NASA will launch 3 sounding rockets during the total solar eclipse on April 8, 2024 to study how the Earth's upper atmosphere is affected when sunlight momentarily dims over a portion of the planet. The atmospheric petrobetons around the eclipse path, or APEP, sounding rockets will launch from NASA's Warlup Flight Facility in Virginia to study the disturbance of the ionosphere created when the moon eclipses the sun. Now I highlighted here the acronym for these rockets, APEP. Now these devils here, they pretend like it's all scientific and it has no spiritual connotation. But when you look further into Esau's studies, how they get into occult practices and everything they do is through signs and symbols, then you understand when they name a device and give it a special acronym like the Satan telescope or the Lucifer telescope or the certain other names or like this APEP. It's all spiritual and it means certain things. Well, what is APEP? APEP is the name of an Egyptian god, which let's read about it to find out who this god is. APEP, also spelled Apepi, says is, or Apotheos, right, in Greek, was an ancient Egyptian deity who embodied darkness and disorder, also chaos, right? Remember, these devils are bringing forth chaos so that way they can eventually bring their order, right? Their solution to the problem they've created. It says, and was thus the opponent of light and Ma'at, which is order and truth. Ra was the bringer of light and hence the biggest opposer of Apep. Okay, so there you go. So you see, these Edomites around the 300 BC, they eventually ended up taking over. Let me actually bring up the timeline. They ended up taking over Egypt, and this took place when Alexander the Great, right? Alexander the Great took over the known world at that time. Okay, he eventually came to Jerusalem, met the priest, left us alone for a while, but then he eventually died, and his 4 generals, they divided up the country or the world, the known world at that time, and Ptolemy, he eventually, I believe this is Ptolemy here. Oh, I'm sorry, this is Ptolemy. Ptolemy ended up taking Egypt, okay? And from this devil's lineage, you basically got a lot of the top elite Edomites today, okay? Some people say the Saxe-Gotha, which is basically the true name of the British crown. They go back to that lineage, which is why Queen Elizabeth would wear little embroidered bees on her, what is it, the robe, the queen robe or whatever, because they try to trace their lineage back to the pharaohs of Egypt. Okay, this is also why the Freemasons, they're all into Egyptian rituals and everything, and that's because they practice the occult wisdom, which is not really even wisdom, it's basically magic that comes out of Egypt, which came from the previous world civilization, the Adamites. Okay, now again, like the Bible says, right, though thou exalt thyself as an eagle, right? Because again, this is plain who Obadiah is speaking about these Edomites who exalt themselves as the eagle, right? They go on and say that they're building their nest up high in the heavens, right? Hence why this eagle has this branch in its hand, right, to start building its nest. But what does the scripture say? This is 1 Corinthians 2:15. But he that is spiritual judges all things, yet he himself is judged of no man. And you see, what these devils are doing by shooting rockets into the shadow of the eclipse is they're ultimately sending a message to the Lord. You see, there was another person in history who also shot at heaven to try to hit the Lord. Okay, and that's more likely where these devils are getting their ideas from. This is Genesis 10:8. And Cush begat Nimrod. He began to be a mighty one in the earth. When you get into Nimrod, you start finding out that the guy is a pretty bad dude. Now, in the Bible, it doesn't say much about him other than how he came about. He was the king over Babylon, and that eventually would build the Tower of Babel. Well, because Nimrod was a real life figure, there's historic records about him. Now, a lot of it back in this time, let's actually go back to the Bible timeline so you can see what I'm talking about. back in the time of Nimrod, right? So you just had Noah's great flood, okay? You had Noah's 3 sons, and from his 3 sons came the 13 nations, right? The first 13 nations, okay? Including the Cush, which is where Nimrod and his wife came out of, okay? Now, Nimrod, like I said, he eventually went on and tried to create the Tower of Babel and basically initiate the first New World Order. That didn't work because the Lord wanted other plans to manifest. Well, eventually Nimrod, he would go on and eventually be deified by these devils. This is what these devils do. Okay, this is part of their magic where they deify you, and then hence you live forever through story and epics and this type of stuff. Well, that's eventually what they did to this man here, right? He descends from Ham, right? And Ham being the firstborn of Noah, he was older, so hence his children were likely older too, and they probably eventually established cities beforehand, and when they went down to Egypt, a lot of that was already there from the previous civilization. Well, like I said, eventually Nimrod would go on, and he eventually wanted to be worshipped by not only his own people, but all the people in the land. And eventually he made himself to be God. And when you get into the word Nimrod, it ultimately means rebellion. Once we look that up here in the Blue Letter Bible, I looked at the word Nimrod, and you get into it, right? Nimrod. Let's go to the word.
Strong's H, 5248. Nimrod.
Rebellion, or the valiant, right? The son of Cush, grandson of Ham, the great grandson of Noah, a mighty hunter. He established an empire in the area of Babylon and Assyria. Well, like I said, Nimrod eventually would go on, and and he was ruler over the people of the world, right? At this time, it was probably about 600,000 people in the world at that point. Well, eventually, the Lord split up the nations, caused them to speak different tongues, and they would, basically separated themselves. Now, all these different nations, all heard of their king, of this famous king that ruled over them. Okay, he was so famous that the way back in the days that they would, record historic events is that they would make stories about the people. Okay, and in this case, Nimrod's story, his deification story, is the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is one of the tablets that tells the story. Well, like I said, eventually this is the what science says is the oldest, superhero story, right? Basically the hero's journey, whatever. But it's basically Nimrod's story, right? Where he wanted to go into heaven and kill God and his army and take over heaven and rule it himself. That was Nimrod and Gilgamesh's modus operandi. Okay, and right here you see him, I believe this is depicting the planets, the sun, and him going into heavens and killing God, right? But again, his fame eventually would grow long past his death, right? Because remember that Nimrod eventually ended up dying, and his wife ended up taking the glory and becoming even a bigger, God than him. Well, Nimrod would eventually, like I said, go on to be worshipped, and over time, the worshiping of him became more of a process than venerating of a particular figure. And this is where you get, large sacrificial, things like this, where it's a bull instead of a man, right? So-called Antichrist, right? Nimrod, right? Who wanted to be worshipped himself, and eventually this started him. It all started there, and this is why around the world you have all these figures that all have similar stories. And why is that? Well, because you see all these different nations that came out of the Tower of Babel when the Lord separated them, they all went away into their own lands and their own people, and they all told, for the most part, stories and their versions of that great epic of Gilgamesh, right, which was a deification of their ancient king Nimrod. Okay, well, this is why you see December 25th, and like I said again, a lot of these were historic characters who had their stories changed. This is why, for example, white Jesus, right? This is why he has nothing to do with the Messiah of the Bible, but he basically copies all the bullet points of Nimrod. Born December 25th, all these lies, that's all goes back to Nimrod. And it isn't an ancient thing. This here tells you here, it says, the Bohemian Grove, 2 future U.S. presidents, Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan, sat round the table in the camps. Owl's Nest, circa 1967, and worshiping the owl statue, Molech. And who is Molech? Well, this is Nimrod, okay? Those statues that they, worshipped back then eventually morphed into this, an owl, okay? Which was representation of Nimrod. Well, let's go ahead and read the story of Nimrod. This right here, remember, this is not biblical, okay? This is from the Jewish Encyclopedia, which means it comes from the Talmud, and more likely this is just Jewish fables. And this is not to go against anything in the Bible, though this tends to match up with the Bible, but the fact is that this is not biblical. You don't find the story of Nimrod shooting arrows into the heavens in the Bible. Okay, that is found in the historic records of him, which are kept from, like in this case, in Jewish encyclopedias or the Talmud or Arabic writings, right? So in this case here, these are a collection of stories of Nimrod, and what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and go down to him shooting, or the story where he shot an arrow into the heavens. So we're going to skip over a lot of this, but the part that we want is right here. Okay, now ultimately, when you get into the story of Nimrod, a lot of it's BS, right? A lot of it says that he was alive during the time of Abraham, which is not likely, and because they lived a long time apart. Now, that being said, this is from a collection from the Sanhedrin 109a, basically the Talmud, okay? But this is the historic record of this man. At least this is what Esau believes of Nimrod, which is why we're going to read this, because I want us to know what Esau believes about Nimrod, okay? Which is, it's going to show you why he's doing this, right? Or the spiritual reason behind what he's doing. It says, Nimrod conceived an idea of building a high tower. Now, this here is after supposedly Nimrod has like a verbal argument after trying to kill Abraham and 12 of his friends. Eventually he finds out about our power, our God, and he's insulted because the Lord didn't want him to be worshipped by Nimrod. So Nimrod, being upset that our Lord wouldn't accept his worship, wanted to do this, wanted to build the Tower of Babel. Now again, remember, this is not biblical, but this is what Esau believes. Okay, so it says, Nimrod conceived the idea of building a high tower by means of which he might accomplish his purpose. After many years had been spent in the construction of the tower, Nimrod ascended to its top, but he was greatly surprised to find that the heavens were still as remote from him as when he was on the ground. He was still more mortified on the following day when the tower collapsed, and such a noise that the people fainted with terror, those that recovered losing their speech, an allusion to the confusion of tongues. Undaunted by this failure, Nimrod planned another way to reach the heavens. He had a large chest made with an opening in the top and another in the bottom. At the four corners of the chest stakes were fixed with a piece of flesh on each point. Then 4 large vultures, or according to another source, 4 eagles previously fed fed upon flesh were attached to the stakes below the meat. So again, you can see it's whimsical storytelling, okay? But the point being is that it tells a narrative. It gives you like an idea of what these people's feelings were. This guy didn't literally make a floating, box out of, eagles or vultures. It just, this is what he had told his subjects and his, writers to write down, because he wanted to publish this and tell this lie to his people, and hence put out that blasphemy. It says, accompanied by one of his most faithful viziers, Nimrod entered the chest, and the 4 great birds soared up in the air, carrying the chest with them. It says, the vizier opened alternatively the upper and lower doors of the chest in order that by looking in both directions he might know whether or not he was approaching heaven. When they were so high that they could see neither in either direction, Nimrod took his bow and shot arrows into the sky. And there you go, right? Nimrod took his bow and shot arrows into the sky. Gabriel thereupon sent the arrows back stained with blood. And when they say Gabriel, they're talking about the angel Gabriel, okay? Now again, this is just not biblical. This is, Jewish fables. It says, so that Nimrod was convinced that he had avenged himself upon Abraham's God. After wandering in the air for a certain length of time, Nimrod descended, and the chest crashed upon the ground with such violence that the mountains trembled, and the angels thought on an order from God had descended upon the earth. This event is alluded to in the Quran. Yeah, see, so this shows you that the Quran is going off, right? Because it uses Jewish fables to base its writings off of it. But that's ultimately the heritage of our people, right? Because you got to remember, back then in these days when we were like Bedouins and travelers on the land, we didn't really write things down like books today. Okay, there was no computers, there were no easy ways to store information. To get paper was a luxury back then, okay, and ink and all that stuff. So the way that these stories were kept and passed on is that you would remember these stories, you would recite them, and then there would be people within the community that were great at this, right? They had the ability to tell stories, to remember details, and they would go on and on, at times to telling various stories. The story of Gilgamesh, or the story of Nimrod going into the sky with these birds and shooting at God, that was all stories, right? And eventually I'm sure there was points to these stories, but those points were lost, and what's happened is there's been a bunch of embellishment that took place, okay? Because obviously you ain't gonna jump in no chest and have vultures or eagles carry you into the sky. They're gonna probably be attacking you and shit, okay? So, but the point being is that people back in these days were so simple that they would hear this from the king and they thought this was, the gospel itself. But we know it today, now that, as the apostles have said, right, we're smarter than our ancestors. We know this is simply just embellishment. We know that this is the heart of a rebellious devil that is now that spirit is now in the hearts of these Edomites who are running the world. So though it was back in the day when Nimrod shot an arrow and then had his court appointers write this story about how he did all these things and ascended into heaven, and that the arrows came back bloodied, and it was Gabriel who did it. See, that right there was like basically government sponsored propaganda. Well, the propaganda of today is a lot different than back then, but it still serves the same purpose. One, it's to send a certain message to the people, and second, in this case, it's to send a message to God, right? And who's sending the message? Well, none other than the serpent himself. These Edomites, these devils who are working with the left hand side angels to bring forward their mission. And what is that mission? To bring forward chaos, destruction, and ultimately the death of 7.5 billion people in the world. Okay, and it doesn't include you or any other Israelites you know, Negro, Latino, Native Americans, right? This is the Edomites' attempt to take over the world, humanity, and God's plan for us. This is Daniel's 2:21. And he changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise and knowledge to them that know understanding. So you see, the Lord set up Nimrod and he took him down. And he's done that on and off since all the way back then. And he rose up these devil Edomites so that way they could be in their position that they are in now. So it doesn't matter what these devils are going to do. It doesn't matter how well the production values on the NASA rocket launches and whatever they're putting into these rockets to crazy shit that these Edomites do. Because again, they're witches, they're warlocks, and they're using magic, right? The art magic to bring forward their process. And that coincidence that those rockets are called the AHPARYAM rockets, that goes back to that Egyptian god of chaos. That's chaos and darkness, right? That's not a coincidence. These devils are bringing forward the hell. And why is that? Well, because of this. This is Job 14:5. Seeing his days are determined, the number of his months are with thee. Thou hast appointed the bounds that he cannot pass. You see, these devils know that their time is almost up. They know that the Lord has set bounds on their empire, and they're doing everything that it can be considered out of the box, or should I say in and out of the box, to try to upset the Lord's prophecy, right? This is why these devils are going to be doing some crazy shit, and these devils may start on April 8th when this eclipse happened. This may be the beginning of their wickedness coming full force, because we know that these devils are going to go crazy eventually, right? They won't be able to hold it back and show restraint. They're going to go all out. And why is that? Well, because just like right now they're committing genocide in Gaza, they know that they're going to have to go full throttle when they're bringing forward their agenda, because it's either us or them, and to them they're not ready to lose this fight or give up the throne, right? This is Revelations 12:12. Therefore rejoice, ye heavens, and ye that dwell in them. Woe to the inhabitants of the earth and of the sea, for the devil is come down unto you, having great wrath, because he knoweth that he hath but a short time. And that's what's going on, right? That's why you're seeing all these bridges being taken out, why you're seeing these terrorist attacks happening in Russia, why you're seeing all these different moves being done by these Edomites, all in an effort to stay in power and to trick the masses and to ultimately microchip everybody on the earth, because they're trying to upset prophecy, but it ain't going to work. They could use all their magic they want. They can shoot as many rockets into the shadow of the eclipse as they want. It ain't going to change anything. The only thing it's going to do is just bring forward more chaos, which is what I'm sure these devils want to do anyways. But either way, Aki, I just wanted to show this lesson, wanted to show something that I remember about these devils' occultic understanding of the King Nimrod and his rebellious acts against the Lord. And hence I'm sure those 3 rockets they're shooting into space are also a rebellious act. But who knows? We'll probably learn more as time goes by or after the events took place. But hope this video was edifying. Until next time, I want to give all honor and glory and praises to Yahawah, Ba'Shem El Shai, Ba'Shem Qadash. Shalom.